The Super Nintendo was at its absolute peak. Street Fighter II turbo-dominated arcades and living rooms. Star Fox proved the SNES could handle 3D graphics. Secret of Mana showed us what RPGs could become. This was the year Nintendo proved the 16-bit generation belonged to them. But for every masterpiece, there were disasters. Games so broken, so lazy, so fundamentally misguided, that they made you question whether the developers had ever actually played a video game before. We're not talking about games that aged poorly. We're talking about games that were terrible the day they launched. Games that cost $50 and delivered nothing but frustration and regret. Today, we're counting down the 10 worst Super Nintendo games from 1993. The shovelware, the cash grabs, the licensed nightmares that proved movie tie-ins were a gamble you usually lost. Stick around because the worst offender might surprise you. If you grew up renting these disasters from Blockbuster, hit that subscribe button. You've earned it. Let's start with number 10. Number 10, Family Dog. Family Dog was a short-lived animated series that aired on CBS in 1993. It came from the minds behind The Simpsons, which should have meant something. Instead, it lasted 10 episodes before getting canceled. The game somehow managed to be worse than the show. You play as the family dog navigating through side-scrolling levels. Sounds simple enough, right? Except the graphics look like they were drawn by someone who'd only heard dogs described over a phone call. The animation is choppy. We're talking maybe 3 frames per sprite. The SNES could handle smooth animation. Look at Donkey Kong Country, or even earlier games like Super Mario World. Family Dog looked like it was running on a Game Boy that someone had dropped in a toilet. The sound design was sparse. You'd get the occasional bark or generic sound effect, but mostly you were treated to silence punctuated by annoying bleeps. No memorable music. Nothing that stuck with you except the desire to turn the volume down. The difficulty was all over the place. Some levels were insultingly easy. Others spiked so hard you'd think the developers were punishing you for buying their game. There was no balance, no learning curve, just random spikes of frustration. Gaming magazines at the time gave it mediocre scores at best. Players who rented it felt robbed of their $3. It was boring, ugly, and forgettable. The only reason it's not lower on this list is because at least it functioned. You could play it from start to finish if you hated yourself enough. But we're just getting started. Number 9, Space Ace. Remember Dragon's Lair? The Laserdisc arcade game from 1983 that looked like a playable cartoon? Space Ace was the follow-up, and it had the same problem. It wasn't really a game. It was a series of QuickTime events where you pressed the right button at the right time, or watched yourself die. The arcade version at least had the novelty of looking incredible for 1983. The SNES port in 1993 had no such excuse. They tried to turn Space Ace into an actual platformer. You controlled Ace through side-scrolling levels, jumping over obstacles and shooting enemies. Except the controls were stiff and unresponsive. Ace moved like he was wearing concrete boots. Jumping felt delayed. You'd press the button and wait a full second before anything happened. The hit detection was broken. Enemies would damage you from 3 feet away. You'd land on a platform and slide right off because the collision detection couldn't figure out where solid ground ended. It was like playing a game where the rules changed every 30 seconds. The graphics were decent by early SNES standards, but this was 1993. We'd already seen what the system could do. Space Ace looked like a launch title that got delayed 3 years. The worst part was the pacing. The game was slow. Everything took forever. Walking from one side of the screen to the other felt like a chore. Boss fights dragged on, because you had to chip away at their health bars, 1 pixel at a time. Space Ace took a concept that barely worked as an arcade novelty, and turned it into a frustrating mess of a platformer. It failed as both an adaptation and as a standalone game. You were better off watching the cartoon on YouTube. Number 8, Incredible Crash Dummies. If you see the LJN logo on a game cartridge, run. LJN was infamous for publishing some of the worst licensed games of the 8-bit and 16-bit eras. Incredible Crash Dummies was their contribution to the SNES library in 1993, and it lived down to expectations. The game was based on a series of PSA characters designed to teach kids about seatbelt safety. Somehow, someone thought this was a viable video game concept. You played as crash test dummies, navigating through levels filled with hazards. The goal was to reach the end without taking too much damage. The problem was that taking damage was unavoidable. The level design was cheap. Enemies appeared out of nowhere. Obstacles were placed in spots where you couldn't react in time. It felt less like a game testing your skills, and more like a game testing your patience. The controls were loose and imprecise. Your dummy would slide around like he was on ice. Jumping was inconsistent. Sometimes you'd make a jump easily. Other times, the exact same jump would send you falling into a pit. There was no consistency. Electronic Gaming Monthly, one of the biggest gaming magazines of the era, tore this game apart. They called out the poor execution, the frustrating gameplay, and the overall lack of polish. This was a game that felt rushed out the door to capitalize on a toy line that kids barely cared about. The graphics were bland. The music was forgettable. The gameplay was tedious. Incredible Crash Dummies was a crash, all right. A crash landing straight into the bargain bin. Number 7. Race Drivin'. Race Drivin' was an arcade game from Atari that featured polygon-based 3D graphics. In the arcade, it was impressive for its time. On the Super Nintendo, it was a technical disaster. The SNES wasn't built for 3D racing games. It could handle Mode 7 graphics, which gave the illusion of 3D by rotating and scaling sprites. F-Zero proved this could work beautifully. Race Drivin' ignored all of that and tried to port the arcade's polygon graphics directly to the SNES. The result was a slideshow. The frame rate was abysmal. We're talking single-digit frames per second in some sections. The track would stutter and jerk as you tried to navigate turns. It was like watching a flipbook where half the pages were missing. The handling was terrible. Your car felt like it was driving on marbles. Steering was either too sensitive or not sensitive enough depending on the track. Braking barely worked. Accelerating took forever. Every aspect of the driving physics felt wrong. The graphics were ugly. The polygons were chunky and poorly textured. The track looked like it was made out of cardboard. Other cars were barely recognizable as vehicles. It looked bad even by 1993 standards. Racing games live or die on how they feel to play. If the controls are tight and responsive, you can forgive a lot. Race Drivin' felt like you were controlling a shopping cart with 3 broken wheels. It was frustrating, ugly, and boring all at once. This was a port that should never have happened. The SNES couldn't handle it, and players paid the price. Number 6. Bebe's Kids. Bebe's Kids was a 1992 animated film that tackled serious social issues through comedy. It was groundbreaking for its time. The video game adaptation was not. You played as characters from the movie navigating through a theme park. It was a side-scrolling beat-em-up mixed with platforming sections. On paper, it could have worked. In execution, it was a mess. The controls were some of the worst on the SNES. Your character moved sluggishly. Attacks had massive delays. You'd press the punch button and wait half a second before anything happened. In a beat-em-up, that delay is death. Enemies would hit you 3 times before your first punch connected. The hit detection was broken. You'd swing at an enemy standing right in front of you and miss. Then an enemy would hit you from off-screen. There was no consistency, no fairness. It felt like the game was actively working against you. The level design was repetitive. Every stage looked the same. You'd walk right, fight the same enemies, walk right some more, fight a boss, and repeat. There was no variety, no creativity. It was the definition of lazy game design. The graphics were mediocre at best. The sprites were small and poorly animated. The backgrounds were bland and forgettable. The music was annoying. After 5 minutes, you'd want to mute your TV. Bebe's Kids frequently appears on worst SNES games lists, and for good reason. It took a movie with heart and turned it into a soulless cash grab. It disrespected the source material and insulted players who spent money on it. This was a licensed game that proved the stereotype. Movie tie-ins were almost always terrible. Number 5. Last Action Hero. Arnold Schwarzenegger was the biggest action star of the early 90s. Last Action Hero was his 1993 summer blockbuster, a meta-comedy about action movies. The game was a side-scrolling beat-em-up that had nothing to do with the movie's clever premise. Gaming magazines gave this game a 1 out of 10 for gameplay. 1 out of 10. That's not a typo. The gameplay was that bad. You played as Arnold punching your way through generic enemies. The problem was that every enemy looked the same. Every fight played out the same. You'd punch, 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 maybe throw in a kick, and repeat for 6 levels. There was no variety, no strategy, no reason to keep playing. The hit detection was awful. Your punches would connect visually, but deal no damage. Enemies would hit you from angles that made no sense. You'd get knocked down, stand up, and immediately get knocked down again, because enemies could hit you during your recovery animation. The difficulty was punishing for all the wrong reasons. It wasn't hard because it required skill. It was hard because the game was broken. Enemies dealt massive damage. You had limited continues. There were no health pickups. You were expected to beat the game through trial and error and sheer stubbornness. The graphics were bland. Arnold's sprite looked nothing like him. The backgrounds were generic city streets and warehouses. The music was forgettable. Everything about this game screamed, "We had 6 weeks to make this before the movie came out." Last Action Hero. The movie was a box office disappointment. Last Action Hero, the game, was a critical disaster. It was repetitive, broken, and boring. It took one of the biggest action stars in the world and turned him into a forgettable sprite in a forgettable game. Number 4. Wayne's World. Party on, Wayne. Party on, Garth. Not in this game. You won't. Wayne's World was a cultural phenomenon in 1992. The movie was hilarious, quotable, and made over $180 million at the box office. The SNES game in 1993 tried to capture that magic and failed spectacularly. The game was a bizarre mix of side-scrolling, platforming, and driving sections. You played as Wayne collecting items and jumping over obstacles. The platforming was simplistic. You jumped, you collected things, you moved to the next screen. There was no challenge, no creativity, no reason to care. The driving sections were somehow worse. You'd drive Wayne's car down a road avoiding obstacles. The controls were terrible. The car handled like a brick. You'd try to change lanes and overshoot. You'd try to slow down and crash into something. It was like playing a bad version of a bad racing game. The sound design was weak. The SNES could produce great audio. Wayne's World sounded like it was running on a Game Boy. The music was tinny and repetitive. There were no voice samples, no memorable tunes, nothing that connected to the movie. The humor from the film was completely absent. Wayne's World worked because of the chemistry between Mike Myers and Dana Carvey. The game had none of that. It was a generic platformer with Wayne's World branding slapped on top. Gaming magazines criticized it for lacking depth. Players who bought it felt ripped off. This was a game that had no business existing. It added nothing to the Wayne's World brand and gave players nothing worth experiencing. If you're a fan of the movie, pretend this game doesn't exist. You'll be happier. Number 3. The Rocketeer. The Rocketeer was a 1991 film that deserved better. It was a fun, pulpy adventure that bombed at the box office. The SNES game in 1993 was somehow even more of a disaster. This game tried to do everything and failed at all of it. It had side-scrolling action levels. It had 3D racing sections. It had light gun shooter segments. None of them worked. The side-scrolling sections were nearly unplayable. The controls were stiff and unresponsive. The Rocketeer moved like he was stuck in molasses. Enemies attacked from all angles, and you had no way to defend yourself effectively. The hit detection was broken. You'd shoot an enemy 5 times, and they'd keep coming. They'd shoot you once, and you'd lose half your health. The 3D racing sections were baffling. You'd fly through a pseudo 3D environment avoiding obstacles. Except the perspective was wrong. You couldn't tell how far away things were. You'd crash into objects that looked like they were in the background. The controls were terrible. The Rocketeer would veer left or right for no reason. The light gun levels were the worst. They were designed for the Super Scope, Nintendo's bazooka-shaped light gun accessory. If you didn't own one, and most people didn't, you had to use the controller. It was clunky, imprecise, and frustrating. Enemies would appear and disappear before you could aim. You'd die repeatedly and have no idea why. The Rocketeer tried to be 3 different games and failed at being even one good game. It was a mess of bad ideas, poorly executed. This was a game that should have been canceled during development. Number 2, Mario is missing. Yes, a Mario game is number 2 on this list. Let that sink in. Mario is Missing was an educational game published by Nintendo in 1993. You played as Luigi trying to rescue Mario from Bowser. Except instead of jumping on Goombas and collecting coins, you were answering geography trivia questions. The plot was absurd. Bowser had stolen famous landmarks from around the world. The Statue of Liberty, the Eiffel Tower, Big Ben. Your job was to travel to these cities, answer questions about them, and return the landmarks. It was like Carmen Sandiego, but worse in every way. The gameplay was painfully slow. You'd walk around a city talking to NPCs. They'd give you vague clues about where you were. You'd have to figure out which city you were in based on these clues. Then, you'd answer multiple choice questions about the city's history and geography. There was no platforming, no action, no reason for this to be a Mario game except to trick parents into buying it for their kids. Luigi controlled like he was walking through quicksand. The cities all looked the same. The questions were boring and repetitive. Gaming magazines gave it a 43.5% average rating. That's an F by any standard. Critics called it tedious, slow-paced, and fundamentally misguided. Kids who wanted a Mario game got a geography lesson. Kids who wanted to learn geography got a boring game. The worst part was that it had good intentions. Educational games can work. Mario Teaches Typing was actually decent. But Mario is Missing failed as both a game and an educational tool. It was too boring to be fun, and too shallow to teach anything meaningful. This was a betrayal of the Mario brand. It proved that even Nintendo could make terrible games when they stopped caring about quality. But as bad as Mario is Missing was, it wasn't the worst game of 1993. Number 1. The Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz is one of the most beloved films of all time. The 1993 SNES game is one of the worst video games ever made. This game is painfully, insultingly boring. You play as Dorothy walking through 4 worlds based on the movie. Munchkinland, the Haunted Forest, the Emerald City, the Witch's Castle. Each world is essentially the same level with minor cosmetic changes. You walk right, you jump over obstacles, you collect items, you reach the end. Repeat. That's the entire game. There's no variety, no creativity, no reason to keep playing except to see if it somehow gets better. Spoiler, it doesn't. The level design is lazy beyond belief. The first level is a straight line. You walk right for 5 minutes. That's it. The second level is the same, but with different colors. The third level adds a few more platforms. The fourth level is slightly longer. That's the extent of the innovation. The graphics are bland and uninspired. The SNES could produce beautiful, colorful games. The Wizard of Oz looks like a tech demo someone made in a weekend. The sprites are small and poorly animated. The backgrounds are empty and lifeless. There's no personality, no charm, no connection to the source material. The music is forgettable. The Wizard of Oz has one of the most iconic soundtracks in film history. The game has generic SNES music that you'll forget the moment you turn off the console. The gameplay is mind-numbingly repetitive. You do the same thing over and over for an hour. There's no challenge. There's no reward. There's no point. It's like watching paint dry, except paint drying is free and doesn't require you to press buttons. This game had no reason to exist. It was a cash grab designed to trick parents into buying it for their kids because they recognized the Wizard of Oz name. It disrespected the source material. It insulted players. It proved that licensed games could be worse than bad. They could be aggressively boring. The Wizard of Oz is the worst Super Nintendo game from 1993. It's not even close. 10 games, 10 disasters, 10 reasons why 1993 wasn't perfect despite the SNES being at its peak. Some of these games were broken, some were lazy, some were both. But they all shared one thing in common. They were terrible the day they launched, and they're still terrible today. Do you disagree with this ranking? Think Wayne's World deserves to be lower? Think Mario is Missing should be number 1? Drop a comment and let's debate. I want to hear which of these games you rented from Blockbuster and immediately regretted. And if you survived the 16-bit era and lived to tell the tale, subscribe to the channel. We've got more retro gaming content coming your way. Thanks for watching. And remember, not every game from 1993 was a masterpiece. Some were just masterpieces of failure.